here the past several weeks, you know that we're walking through an Old Testament book called Daniel. Daniel is a book that's it's called one of the prophets because of some of the things that take place in it. But the book of Daniel, what we're seeing, actually answers a significant question for us today. And here's the question that we've been answering the past several weeks, and this is it. How do you and I live as a person who loves and follows Jesus in this cultural moment? In other words, how do you and I live our faith out? How do we live as people of the gospel? How do we live as Jesus followers and retain our identity as the people of God in a culture like today? How do we engage our culture? How do we love our city? How do we do the things that I just talked about? How do we live robust lives in our city and not lose our identity and actually influence it for good and influence it for God? How do we do that? John Tyson writes this. He says, Jesus' vision was that we would be a city on a hill, talking about the church, that we'd be a city on a hill, and that people would see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven of their own accord, irrespective of the laws on the books, the rulings of the courts, or the leaders in power. And I love this next sentence. He says, his heart was that we would influence culture through redemptive participation in the context of communities in relationship. Conversely, he also warned that if we lost our saltiness, we'd be good for nothing but to be trampled underfoot. Maybe this is what we're experiencing now as his people. In other words, Jesus' followers living in community together, engaged in culture, are supposed to be difference makers. That's the point of what he's saying, right? The way that we live is intended to influence. The way we live our lives out is intended to make a difference. And that happens whether or not you and I have positional authority or not. Whether or not people say, oh, you're in a position of influence, why don't you come dictate these things? It happens regardless of that, or irregardless of it. It happens whether or not we have cultural agreement. Like whether or not culture agrees with us or not doesn't really matter. We still are called to influence, and it doesn't matter whether or not we are in the majority or the minority. We just are called to do this. What we know is that this does not happen if we hide. If we privatize our faith, if we just say, well, this is my thing, and I don't, it doesn't have any public ramifications, then we never influence culture. We know that it doesn't happen if we're just swallowed up by culture. We just become the culture around us. We understand, and what we've been looking at the past several weeks is that we are called to live full lives, engaged in culture and society around us, but at the same time, we're called to not lose our identity as the people of God. It's a third way to live that Daniel is presenting to us. But that immediately lands us on this question, well, then how do we do that? Because that's really complicated. And just like all of you, I don't find this easy. I look and go, how do we live as people of influence, fully engaged, and not just get absorbed by culture? How does it happen? And I think this is where the power of the book of Daniel really arises and where it intersects our lives in a very dynamic way. And I love this because if you notice this, Daniel and his friends, if you've been here through this series, you'll notice that they are not professional Jesus people or Yahweh people. You notice they're not professional pastors. They're not professional prophets. They aren't professional ministers. I love this about them. These individuals are individuals who are doing jobs just like everybody else. I mean, they've got a job in government. They've got a job in middle management. They've got spreadsheets. They've probably got some sort of ancient version of Excel that they've got to keep up with. They've got lives. Like Daniel and his companions, these guys are reading about, they're just doing life. And they've got a 9-to-5 thing just like we do, right? And so I love that about them, that what they're modeling for us is people who are regular people. Not only that, in this particular moment, they don't have circumstances that are ideal. Their circumstances are the kind in which if you make a mistake, you're torn limb from limb or you're thrown in a fiery furnace, right? There are times for us we go, man, how in the world am I going to be a person of influence when culture just seems to be shifting so rapidly, when it seems so complicated and sometimes just seems so oppositional? There are times it seems very daunting for us to be culture shapers, but there's no way that our culture is more daunting than the one that they're in. Can you agree with me on that? And so I love this. It's incredibly complicated for them. How do you shape a culture that is so opposed to you? And then thirdly, they're a minority in this culture. They do not have numbers on their side. Everybody's going one way, and they're going another. And yet there are these people of influence. And Daniel and his companions reveal a path for us as we look at these texts that we can actually follow. And here's what I find really interesting about this path they show us. This is what's fascinating. The path is completely different than what we'd expect. Because like our culture, we say, well, if you want to have influence, then there's things you have to do. And yet when we look at Daniel and his companions, Daniel does not seek power and try to climb the corporate ladder. Now, he's promoted. We've been reading about his promotions, but his promotions at his job are a byproduct of him living out his faith and being a person of influence. It is not his pursuit. He's not saying, I'm going to change culture by rising in the echelons of business. He doesn't do that. He doesn't run for political office. There's no place where it says Daniel was out petitioning or doing those sorts of things. He doesn't amass wealth and say, I'm going to get all the money I can, and then I can control and I can make decisions, and if I have money, then I can make these things happen. We don't have anything being told us about that. Thank goodness he does not picket and condemn. Like nowhere do we ever catch Daniel and his friends with a bullhorn and signs in downtown Babylon. Like, turn or burn, Babylon. Like nowhere do we see them doing this, right? So what was it? What we see over and over again it was their faith. It was their commitment to being distinct and yet engaged. It was this commitment to saying there are compromises we're not willing to make. And ultimately, it was their character. There are things in their character as people, the way they lived their lives, the way they lived out in the middle of life that made them people of influence. In fact, today, as we dive into this next chapter, we're going to see a principle that is actually being lived out by Daniel, and it actually gets taught to Nebuchadnezzar. He teaches this to Nebuchadnezzar in a strange set of circumstances, and then he begins to live it out. And there's this principle that arises out of this that isn't just lived by Daniel, but if it's lived by us, allows us to be people of pretty significant influence. In fact, I want to give you this principle up front this morning, and then we're going to talk about it as we move through the text. So here it is. Influence diminishes through pride, but increases through humility. Say that with me real quick, just to make sure we're all awake. Influence diminishes through pride, but increases through humility. So in other words, when pride goes up, when you and I get more prideful, our influence on the people around us goes down, right? And some of us already know that to be true because the prideful people around us have very little influence over us, right? And yet at the same time, when our humility goes up, our influence goes up. So the more prideful we become, the less influence we have. The more humble we become, the more influence we have. Now, just to be clear, we are not talking about positional authority. We're not talking about being appointed to positions that give you authority. We are talking about something I call real influence. Real influence. Not positional influence, but real influence. And there's a difference, right? Can we all agree there's a difference between positional authority and real influence? Like, some people have positional authority. Your boss has positional authority over you. Your professor has positional authority over you. Law enforcement has positional authority over us. Just remind yourself of that next time you're speeding, right? You get mad and you want to complain. They have positional authority, right? It's very different than influence. In fact, if you ask anyone in those jobs, ask a teacher, ask law enforcement, ask somebody in government, ask somebody, is there a difference between positional authority and influence? And they will tell you there is a distinct difference. It's one thing to have positional authority, but influence is something else. And if you can have influence, that's the real goal. So this is why most of us have had these experiences where we've been on a team or you've been a part of an organization, and there's always seems to be somebody somewhere who just has the ability to influence. Like they may not be the boss, they may not be the manager, they may not be the team captain, they may not be the coach, but there's that person who has the ability through the way that they live their life to influence the way that people believe and the way that people behave. There's a person who has influence, right? Have you guys experienced that? There's always that person you're like, man, they're not the team captain, but they just seem to influence. Or they're not the coach, they're not the CEO, but when they say stuff, people just seem to listen, and they have the ability to move things in a particular direction. Are you with me on this? Influence. There's influence that happens through character. And specifically that influence comes when our humility increases. So I want you to open up to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, and for time's sake, I'm just going to summarize the first 18 verses this morning. Chapter 4 opens up, and if you've been in this series, you know that Nebuchadnezzar, we have no idea what the guy eats before he goes to bed at night, but when he wakes up the next morning, he has had some pretty crazy dreams. And unlike you and I, he thinks his dreams are very, very important, and so he seeks people out to interpret those dreams. And in this particular story, in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream about a tree that expands over the world, and it has like animals living underneath it and feeding off of it and giving shelter to them, and then the tree gets cut in half, and it's kind of a crazy thing. And so he seeks to have the dream interpreted. And again, kind of like you see before, there's all these people that he calls, his wise men, his counselors, everybody come, tell me what this thing means. And nobody knows what it's about. And so finally he comes to Belteshazzar, also known as Daniel, and he says, Daniel, you seem to always know the answer to these things. Will you come tell me what my dream is about? And so he tells him the dream. Unlike the dream we heard about earlier in this series where he said, tell me what the dream is and then interpret it. This time he gives him a break and is like, here's what I dreamt. What do you think? So where we pick up in the reading in verse 19, Daniel has just heard this, and now we have his response. It says, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. So he hears this, he's dismayed, and he's like, I don't know what's going on here. And the king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. After all, I'm not the kind of person that would throw your friends in a fire, right? Like, just tell me what's on your mind. I won't get mad, I promise you. And I won't tear you limb from limb, right? Kind of understand why Daniel might be distraught, right? So he hears this dream, and then he says, my Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. Now, what he's alluding to is that this dream is not a good one. It isn't a beautiful dream. It isn't a good dream. It's actually a dream of calamity. And so he starts by saying, I wish this was for your enemies. But then he knows it's not good, and so he continues in verse 20, and he says, the tree that you saw, which grew and became strong so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived, it is you, O king. This tree that you've dreamt of, that's you, right? You who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. You could almost imagine Nebuchadnezzar beaming in this moment and being like, I am a beautiful tree. Like, he's just like, this is amazing, right? In other words, this dream is about you. You are the tree in the dream. And then he continues, verse 24, and he says, this is the interpretation, O king. It is the decree of the Most High which has come upon my lord the king. Now, this is really interesting because this would have been an affront to Nebuchadnezzar right here because he considered himself the Most High. And now Daniel in this moment is saying, no, there's another one higher than you, and you're my lord the king. And so he says, there's a decree for you coming from one that's higher than you. And he says this, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Notice that there's a clause in here. You will be in this state until you know. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. So something's going to happen when you realize this truth that needs to be in your heart. So he says basically this, Nebuchadnezzar, you are amazing, but you are about to be less amazing. In fact, what he's alluding to is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar would actually have some sort of mental breakdown. He would lose his mind. Historians and scholars all agree that Nebuchadnezzar isn't just humbled in this moment, but that he literally becomes like an animal. He loses his faculties, that out of this like sort of narcissistic moment, he begins to live this crazed life out in the wilderness. Like the king of Babylon, the most powerful person on the planet at that time, goes to live this way until you know that God rules the kingdom of men and gives to whom he will. So Daniel basically says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to be humbled until you submit to the idea that you are not the one in charge, until you humble yourself. And then he continues, and he's going to encourage him, and he says in verse 27, therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. And you might hear it this way, that Daniel's saying, choose humility now. Like Nebuchadnezzar, not every lesson has to be learned the hard way. Like, you don't have to go through with this, right? Learn humility. Embrace humility. And I love this because while Daniel teaches it, he also lives it, doesn't he? You notice, like he says, oh, king, like, may my counsel be acceptable to you. I mean, there's this approach that Daniel has to this individual that is incredibly inspiring. He's not pompous. He's not arrogant. In fact, he isn't even excited that the king is going to finally get what's coming to him. When you think about this from Daniel's perspective, a guy who was ripped from his homeland, he was stripped of his culture, his friends have been threatened, he lives this life almost as a slave, but not quite a slave. He lives in this environment, and now he gets this word, this vision that the king who rules him is going to have his demise. You'd think there'd be like a little smirk on his face. And yet there doesn't seem to be any. There's like no celebration. And Daniel, in all of his humility, he literally says, this isn't about me. This is like, he wants what's best for this guy. And he delivers the truth in total humility. Notice what happens. It says in verse 28 that all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. So in other words, he didn't listen to Daniel's appeal, didn't listen to what he had to say. And then it says in verse 29, at the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? And while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men. He ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. Kind of a nasty picture, isn't it? So he surveys his kingdom. He's like, man, am I just amazing? And then suddenly in that moment, he loses his mind, and he's cast out of his kingdom. And literally, he is out living in the wild. He becomes like an animal. And then what's really interesting about Daniel is Daniel allows Nebuchadnezzar to speak to the narrative. And so what we read next is actually the words of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel after these events. So verse 34, it says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. In other words, I started seeing things clearly again. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Now, what has God done to Nebuchadnezzar? He's humbled him, right? He was humbled. He comes to this point where he truly recognizes and he repositions his heart in a way that says, God is the one who really rules over me, and I don't have the control that I thought I had. I mean, he's a guy, when you think about this, who considered himself the Most High, the most powerful man on the planet, and now he calls God the Most High. Here's a guy who demanded the worship of others, and now he's worshiping the God of the universe. Here's an individual who is obsessed with his own greatness and his own kingdom, and now he's celebrating a kingdom that he says, that kingdom goes way beyond my kingdom ever will. Like, he just sees with new eyes, and his heart is being changed because of this. And I love the last part where he says, all the inhabitants of the earth, they're counted as nothing. It's like he's saying, listen, none of us matter. He like levels himself down and he goes, do you understand? Like, I'm not that big of a deal. None of us really matter in comparison to God. He was humbled. When I was in college, I was kind of getting my life back on track and beginning to like follow Jesus and starting to realize like there was more to life than the stuff I was doing. And so that season was filled with summits and valleys, no pun intended, but there were highs and lows. And during that season, my college pastor, a guy named Rob Williams, I'm just indebted to him because he just was there alongside of me, and then he connected me. He actually manipulated me into this relationship with a guy named Brad Henry, and he made it seem like it was just happenstance. It turns out they had planned it all along, but this guy, Brad, was going to start mentoring me, and so I would meet Brad in the mornings. There were mornings on certain weeks when I would go meet him at this place called Java City on 35th Avenue in Phoenix, and I'd meet him before school and before work and before internships. I would go hang out with him for like an hour, and he would just tell me about his life, and his life was nuts. In fact, Brad was a college athlete. He was a runner. He ran at Bucknell. He had a full-ride scholarship, and when he was on the team there, he went to a party one night, And he smoked some marijuana that was laced with something. Somebody had put something else in it, some other sort of chemical or drug. And all of a sudden, while he's at the party, his heart starts beating incredibly fast. And so somebody rushes him to the emergency room. He goes in there, and they discover what he has taken in, the chemicals he's taken in. And the doctor said to him, if you weren't the athlete that you are, you would be dead right now. However, this has damaged your heart, and for the rest of your life, there's a medication that you're going to have to take because of the damage that's been done. And so he prescribes this medication and then says, but you can no longer run. Like, your running career is over. Like, the damage that was done in this moment. And so Brad lost his scholarship and lost his opportunity to run, and just his whole identity was stripped from him. And this is the kind of person he is. He kind of thought about life, and a couple years later decided he was going to be an airline pilot. And so he becomes a 747 pilot. So he kind of turns from that and goes and does this. The problem is, one night he's doing a layover, and I don't remember if it was like Chicago or New York, but in one of those cities, he's doing a layover one night, and the morning when he wakes up, he can't get his nose to stop bleeding. And so he finally goes to a doctor, goes to like an urgent care type place, and the doctor starts looking at it, and he goes, well, there's this medication that you're on because of the heart and the thing that happened in college, that's causing this right now. And so, here's what we can do to stop this or fix this. Well, what the doctor didn't tell him was that drug was banned by the FAA. And then without telling him, that doctor, after he left, contacted the FAA and said, this pilot is using this illegal banned substance. And so as a result, he lost his career as a pilot. Now, Brad is like a serial entrepreneur. You know what I'm talking about? Like, the guy just creates stuff. And so after that, he's like, well, you know what? Then I'm going to start my own business. And so he started all these different businesses. And we would sit and have coffee in the morning. He would tell me about the crazy things that he's done. In fact, one of the craziest that I loved was at one time he decided to package like suntan lotion inside of coconuts. And so he got factories around the world to do this, and then sold these lotion-filled coconut things, whatever, with this stuff. I don't even know how the thing worked, but it was this thing that he did, and he sold it all these different resorts. It didn't take very long for people to realize that the coconuts, when they were in the luggage, in the airplane going home from whatever place, that they would explode because of the pressure and ruin everything inside. So there was a class action lawsuit, and he lost everything that he made. I mean, literally, this guy, every time, everything he ever gained, he would just lose it. He lost everything. Just his whole story, even from his childhood, he lost his father to a massive heart attack when he was 8 years old. I mean, the guy just would lose everything. And I remember him telling me about this moment when he was in the Las Vegas desert at a place that I don't need to talk about in church, when he hit rock bottom and he realized, my life is absolutely going nowhere. And he was in the wilderness and he was living like a beast. And he came out on the other side and he discovered who Jesus was, and he started to turn his life over and humble himself. And I'm sharing this with you to say there's something about sitting across the table from somebody who has lost everything, and they've come out on the other side, and they're still alive, and there's something when you look in their eyes, there is this peace, and there is this resiliency, and there is this hope that you find in a person who has gone through this. A hope that comes when somebody has experienced true humility. And isn't it interesting that when you and I meet somebody who's gone through stuff like that, when they sit down with a cup of coffee and say, hey, can I just give you some advice on life? Isn't it interesting that they have way more influence than the average person does? Humility increases influence. A person's humility increases their influence. Let me just read on. Verse 36, Nebuchadnezzar continues. He says, at the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. And my counselors and my lords, they sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Do you hear what's happening? He was humbled, and his influence increased. And then verse 37, I love this. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful guy on the planet, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to what? Humble, right? His ways are just, and he will humble people who walk in pride. So many of us view humiliation as punishment, right? You go through bad circumstances and things happen, and you kind of view a moment like that as punishment. You listen to my friend Brad's story, and you go, yeah, man, those things seem like, what did he do to deserve that? In fact, that's kind of the sick way we start thinking about our relationship with God, is like, what did I do to make you angry? And we get in this weird manipulative relationship with God, and it's nowhere healthy. And maybe in the moment you feel like it's punishment, but the truth is, what if it is actually a gift? What if the humiliation is a gift? Because when you understand the power of humility and what it does for us and the way it makes us people of peace and the way it makes us people of resilience and the way that it makes us people of influence, could it be that humiliation, like when we are humbled, that it's actually God's mercy and that he's actually giving us a gift and he's saying, actually, you're going to be somebody on the other side of this that has way more influence than you ever had before. So we're not talking about false humility. We're talking about a reorientation of the heart, a submission of the will. That there's this recognition where we stand in the world. And when you and I ditch the pride and we embrace the humility, our influence gains and we become better people to live with. And by the way, here's the most beautiful thing. You do not have to grow hair like eagle's feathers and have long claws and live like a wild person in the desert to experience humiliation. I know some of you are like, great, what am I looking forward to? There's a specific kind of humility that is available to you without the outrageous circumstances, and it does not require grazing among beasts. And it has a name, and if there's nothing you remember from this morning, let it be this. It is called gospel humility. There is a humility that comes through the gospel that is powerful and is life-altering. And let me just explain this. The cross repositions us permanently. There is something permanent about the cross of Jesus, which is why we return to the cross over and over and over again. It's why we always come back to the gospel. We return to the gospel because when we come back to the message of Jesus and we come back to the message of the cross, it reminds us of very specific, very powerful things. First of all, whenever I approach the gospel, whenever I think about Jesus and the cross and what he's done for me, it reminds me immediately of my brokenness. Like, you can't look at the cross and not be reminded, okay, there are times when I'm blind and I don't see things as they should be seen. There are times when my emotions will defy my logic. There's times when my logic is flawed. There are times when my desires betray me. Those things, that's a part of who I am. You look at the cross, you can't deny your brokenness. If we're not broken, there's no need for a cross, right? So there's something about the gospel that humbles us, that when we see the gospel, it just puts us in this place of saying, okay, I really am not that big of a deal. In fact, I tend to mess things up. But then simultaneously, in the same moment, when we look at the cross, there is another truth that corresponds with this, that says you are loved and you are accepted by the God of the universe. I'm reminded that God is for me and not against me. I'm reminded that I don't have to do anything to earn God's favor, his approval. And because of that, I become more confident. And so there is this humble confidence that comes out of the gospel of Jesus. That is gospel humility. Pride is eradicated, but it is replaced with this sense of humility, but also confidence because we know where we stand with God. See, you know, in our culture, humility is always associated with weakness, and confidence is always equated with pride. And yet in the gospel, we find this unique position of being both humble and confident. It's completely different than anything else. And I don't know if you realize that, but the gospel of Jesus is the only place where you get the verdict before you get the performance. You realize that? Like everywhere else, it's the performance, then the verdict. Like an atheist, if you don't believe in God, you might say, well, I'm going to get my self-image and I'm going to derive my self-worth from being a good person. But if that's what you say, then you have to live your life in such a way that at some point people are going to affirm or deny whether or not that is true. And so you perform for a verdict. Were you or were you not a good person? Every religious system in the world works by the same principle. I need to behave a certain way. I need to perform in order for God to have favor with me. In order for God to be pleased with me, I've got to do these certain things. So I'm going to jump through all these religious hoops to get to this next level or this next place. But the gospel of Jesus is completely different because the verdict is delivered first. This is who you are. And the performance happens out of that. It happens after that. There's a proclamation, and then we just begin to live lives out of the freedom of what's already been determined about us. You are broken, and yet you are also deeply loved, and God is for you. There's a freedom in this, isn't there? There's a freedom. There's a freedom when we experience that kind of humility. Tim Keller says this way. He says, the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. I love that, right? Gospel humility is not thinking about myself, not needing to connect everything with myself. Not every story is about me. Not every circumstance is about me. Not everything has to do with me. It's like, it's not about me. In fact, it isn't about me and it isn't about you, right? We need to hear that sometimes. It isn't all about us. Our culture says it is all about us, but it isn't. And in the end, we are liberated. Because of the verdict of Jesus, we are no longer wondering whether or not we're building our resume or people like us or don't like us or whether the group we're with makes us look good or look bad. We find ourselves doing things out of the joy of doing them. We find ourselves loving people for the sake of loving them, not to get something back from them. We find ourselves thinking about ourselves less. Just last night, I was at a birthday party, and there were a bunch of people around telling stories. It was like one of those times where a bunch of guys around telling stories, and guys tell stories. And also, when guys tell stories, other guys want to tell better stories than the story that was just told, right? We call it one-upping, right? In fact, this morning, one of my friends told me he has a friend who he's convinced one of these days will tell him he's an astronaut, because he keeps one-upping him so much. He's like, this guy, he goes, one of these days I'm going to get him to admit he's an astronaut because he just cannot not one-up me. But I was standing around these conversations, and every time somebody was telling a story, I found in my own self, there was this thing of like, ooh, I want to tell a story that's about that same thing. And then you just realize, no, not every story is about me. Not every moment is about me. Not every moment is about you. Sometimes we can just sit in humble confidence and listen. And it doesn't have to be about us. And here's what I've noticed. The people in my life with the greatest amount of influence have the greatest amount of humility. Are you with me? And the way that you and I become people of influence will not be through our dominance. It will not be through positional authority. It will not be through power. And it will not be through pride. But it will be through the quiet confidence of gospel humility. I imagine the tension for Daniel in this moment as he stands there and he hears the dream and he goes, I am not going to care about what you think about the truth I'm going to tell you. And I'm not even going to care about what I think about the truth that I'm going to tell you. All I'm going to care about is what he thinks about the truth that I'm going to tell you. And I just want to encourage you to think for a moment about the circumstances that you find yourself in right now. And I want you to consider what the gospel says the Lord thinks about you and how that will change you in whatever moment you're in. Think for a second the verdict that has been proclaimed over you and whatever insecurities, whatever lack of confidence, whatever anxieties, whatever fears. Those things change when we realize, yes, we're broken, but we are also deeply loved. Amen? Amen. Would you stand with me? As you stand this morning, I want to mention something just briefly that we are a praying community. When we live this life of Christian faith, we believe in prayer. We believe prayer is powerful. We believe that we should pray for people and pray with people, which is why every week there's folks that are on our prayer team that really feel gifted and called to pray for you. And in fact, they pray during our services. They pray all the time. And oftentimes they're available after the services to pray with. And then they stand down here really awkwardly as we all walk the other way, right? Because we're like, oh no, first of all, going to be prayed with up front, you're like a salmon swimming upstream. That's really hard to do. And then secondly, if I go up front, then people are going to think I have problems bigger than I do. And the truth is, we already think you've got problems. So don't worry about what we think. No, but for real, I just want to say that we love praying with you and for you. And so on any given week, as you're hanging out and as you're leaving, if you want somebody to pray with you or for you, if you just need to get some advice, our prayer team is here to do that. And so I just encourage you to pay attention to who they are, what they're doing, and hang out for a minute, let people sneak out. They won't think you're weird, and then just come down front. Sound good? All right. We are a praying community. May you be men and women who experience gospel humility at its best. May you know the confidence and the peace and the joy that comes when you are humbled, not by your circumstances, but by what Jesus has done for you. Amen. Amen. Love you guys so much. Have a great, great Sunday, and we'll see you guys next week. See you later.